Welcome to all those kings, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is our sixth class, and we're going to be talking today about some of the worst of the kings. But I wanted to just review something that we finished up with last week. We talked about the career of Elijah, the prophetic career of Elijah, and to kind of bring closure to the story, I showed you the end of the life of Elijah, where he was carried off to heaven in a fiery chariot with fiery horses. However, his career as a prophet covered the last several years of the life of Ahab, and he actually survived Ahab by a couple of years before he died. So what we're going to do is back up a little bit into what happened after he was instructed by the Lord on Mount Sinai as to what it was he was to accomplish. One of the remarkable, we only have a couple of stories about Ahab. We have the story of the confrontation on Mount Carmel, but then we have this astonishing story of events that happened dealing with the vineyard of Naboth. Ahab wanted the vineyard of Naboth down in Jezreel. His palace was in a place called Samaria, which is up in the hill country, and 25 or 30 miles away down near the Jordan Valley was the town of Jezreel, which was probably their winter palace area. It's much lower. It could be as much as 30 degrees warmer between Samaria and Jezreel, so they would have gone down to that area regularly. And a choice piece of property, a vineyard, was something that Ahab wanted, but as king, apparently he did not have the authority to simply appropriate the property. Property was passed down through the family, and he went to Naboth and he said, "I'd like to buy your vineyard." And Naboth said, "No, I won't give you my family's inheritance," which upset Ahab, and we get this very unflattering description of his behavior. It says he lay on his bed sulking and refused to eat. Now, this is not the behavior of a king, obviously, and his wife pointed that out to him. She went on and said, "Is this how you act as king?" And then she went on to say, "Cheer up, I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth." So she then set in motion a series of actions in which she plotted for the death of Naboth. She wrote letters in Ahab's name. She placed his seal on them and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city with him. In other words, she presented herself with her writings as being the king. And when these were sent to the various elders and leaders of the city, they assumed these were orders from the king. And she instructed them that they were to set up a banquet and put Naboth in the place of honor. And then during the banquet, two scoundrels would stand up and accuse him of treason and blasphemy, saying that he had cursed both God and the king, both of which were capital offenses, and then they would take him out immediately and stone him to death. And that's exactly what happened. After this was done, she told Ahab, and then he went down and he bought the property, which he was able to do as king once this person had been executed as being treasonous to the king. Now, this was a terrible thing, and it didn't go unnoticed. And again, we have Elijah being instructed to go and talk to Ahab and let him know what the punishment, what the consequences of this particular action would be. The Lord sent Elijah to say to Ahab, "In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood." This is what's going to happen to Ahab specifically. And then he goes on and says, "I will make your house like that of Jeroboam and that of Baasha, because you have caused Israel to sin." Now, if you remember, the first king of Israel, the northern kingdom, was Jeroboam. And after his son was assassinated by Baasha, Baasha went back and wiped out the family of Jeroboam. We talked about that last time. And then after Baasha died, his son took the throne and was assassinated by Zimri, who then went back and wiped out the family of Baasha. And the reason this was done is so that there would be no survivors of a family line who could come forward and say, "I am the legitimate heir." So this is what Ahab's being told. Your family's going to be wiped from the face of the earth, and there will be nobody of your line. And then he went on and says, "Dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel." This is what's going to happen to Jezebel. Now, she is obviously the evil woman in this story, And the Bible points out that there was never a man like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, urged on by Jezebel, his wife. One of the interesting things about Ahab, he's very important apologetically because we can date him. We can put a specific year on when he lived and died. And it appears that at the end of his life, he was involved in two major military actions. We are told of one when he died, but he was involved in a major military action that same year prior to his death that's not mentioned in the Bible, but is historical and is a remarkable confirmation of the fact that this was a real man who fought real battles. If you look at the map here, this is looking north through Israel, and we're talking about something that happened in 853 BC. It's called the Battle of Karkar, and it's against an Assyrian king named Shalmaneser III, who is not mentioned in the Bible. Actually, the Assyrians by name and by king don't show up in the Bible for another 100 years. They were not important until much later, but at this time, they were beginning their expansion westward, and we have Israel and Judah on the west side of the Great Rift there, and then down the east side of the rift we have these smaller kingdoms, the Arameans, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, and they're all contesting among themselves for little pieces of property. Really, these are minor battles between the various groups. However, the Assyrians have been rising to power way off in what's modern Iraq. They have been spreading westward, and they're extending their hegemony all the way to the Mediterranean at this point in the middle 800s. And Shalmaneser had an army apparently up at a place called Karkar, which would be in modern Syria. And for once, all of these small kingdoms down in what was Canaan decided to form a coalition and confront the Assyrians. It's the only time they all worked together. And they all sent their various components to this coalition up to Karkar and fought a major battle against the Assyrians at that time. Now, the Assyrians made an inscription, Shalmaneser did, in which he bragged about having defeated this huge coalition of Canaanite armies. But as the reality of what happened sets in, it turns out that he really was stopped, and he was forced basically to retire back to the Assyrian regions, and the Assyrians did not threaten this part of the world for another 100 years. So even though he's bragging on his inscription that he beat all these people, he apparently did not. And they have found this stela, which is like a huge tombstone, kind of shaped like a tombstone with an inscription on the front of it. Kings would erect these with various inscriptions on them, and this was found at a place called Kurch. And in it, he's bragging about all of the people that he defeated in this coalition, and he mentions Ahab. Ahab brought all these chariots and all these soldiers, and he listed about 11 kings who were leaders of the various coalition, but Ahab is one of them. So he fought in this battle, and he survived, and we have a mention of the man historically outside the Bible. That is truly valuable. Now, later that same year, as it turns out, as we date things, Ahab died in a battle, and he was fighting with the king of Judah, whose name was Jehoshaphat. Some of you may know the term jumping Jehoshaphat. I tried to search that out, and they have no idea what that means. Nobody has. We don't even know if it refers to this particular king or whether it was just an alliterative statement that sounded better than cursing with the name of the Lord. They're not sure where this all came from. But anyway, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, and Ahab, the king of Israel, were fighting the Arameans. So here we have this remarkable situation where the Arameans, combined with everybody else, fought the Assyrians, and then just a few months later, they're back fighting among themselves again. And this is when Ahab died. Here's one other archaeological moment that I wanted to show you. The Bible says that after Ahab died, the king of Moab, and we know his name to be Mesha. Incidentally, these little parenthetical things you see in there are what I put in. These are not in the text. I put those in there so that you don't have to do 2 or 3 or 4 different verses. It says that the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel, and this would have been Joram, who was the son of Ahab. Ahab died, his son is there, and the Moabites broke loose. And This is another stela that was found. It's called the Moabite stone. This was commissioned by the king of the Moabites. And it says, as for Omri, king of Israel, he humbled Moab for many years, but I have triumphed over him, while Israel hath perished forever. Now that's a bit excessive to say that Israel perished forever, but at any rate, we now have confirmation of Omri. Omri was the king who conquered the Moabites, and for a couple of reigns, a couple of generations, Israel had control over the Moabites, but when Ahab died, the Moabites broke free, and they were bragging about the fact that they have broken free of the yoke of Omri. So we, again, have another outside confirmation of these kings, and a confirmation of a specific passage in the Bible. And then after Ahab died, Elijah was carried up to heaven, and we talked about that briefly. He had already anointed his successor, a man named Elisha. And from this point on, Elisha is the prophet who interacts with the house of Ahab. This is a very confusing period of time if you read through the text, because it jumps back and forth from various kings and various times. But it's not complicated if you look at it. I've tried to put it together in a chart, and hopefully this will help a little bit. But we're going to be looking at the various kings back and forth of Israel and Judah. We have Ahab, who took the throne, and he ruled for 20-some years. And almost at the same time that he came to the throne, a new king came to the throne down in Jerusalem at Judah, and his name was Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat ruled for just a couple of years longer than Ahab. So the two of them kind of ruled in tandem. And as it turns out, Ahab and Jehoshaphat apparently hit it off, arrived at an understanding, and worked in concert, even though they were different kingdoms. Now, Jehoshaphat had a son, Jehoram, who was going to be his designated heir. Ahab, this is way back early in their relationship, Ahab apparently had a beautiful young daughter named Athaliah. And the way that you would cement your relationships between various kingdoms is to have sons and daughters marry. That way you all become family. And maybe you're less inclined to interact militarily with each other. So Athaliah was married off to Jehoram, the crown prince. Now, years passed. When Ahab finally died, his throne was taken over by an elder son named Ahaziah. And Ahaziah, we are told, only ruled for 1 year, which means it's actually, if they said 1 year, it's actually between two New Year periods, and it may have only been a few months. In other words, he was on the throne for a very short period of time, fell through the roof of the palace, severely injured himself, and he died. And incidentally, just again as an archaeological comment, buildings in those days had walls that were a certain space. For example, the temple was only 30 feet wide. You build a major temple by Solomon, and it's only a 30-foot wide room, maybe about the size of this. And the reason for that is the roof of all of these buildings was constructed by laying wooden beams side by side and then thatching it in. That's the only way they could build a roof, and you were restricted to the size of the beams that were available in the land in those days. Now, the cedars of Lebanon could give you 30-foot beams, but most of these places have 6-foot rooms or 8-foot rooms because you just don't have pieces of timber that are bigger, and when they're thatched, if you're walking on them, you can fall through. In fact, there's a story in the New Testament where Jesus is preaching in a house, and they lower an individual through the roof. All they had to do was separate it out a little bit, and you can imagine Jesus there preaching, and he sees the thatch coming down, and then somebody lowered through. It's a very believable story. So anyway, Ahaziah died and was followed immediately by a younger brother named Joram, who was going to rule for 11 years, and then he's going to be assassinated. So at the time that Ahab died, Jehoshaphat also died, and so his son Jehoram takes the throne with his queen Athaliah, who's a pagan princess descended from Ahab. She's a daughter of Ahab. There are people who would argue that her mother was Jezebel, That's not in the Bible. That's a traditional conclusion, and it makes for a better story, but it's probably not true. Ahab would have had lots of children with lots of wives and concubines. But at any rate, he was her father. Jehoram was a really nasty guy. He had 6 brothers, and he assassinated all of them when he took the throne so that there would be no one to claim the throne from him. And we are told in the Bible, he only ruled for 7 years, and then he died. The last 2 years in very great pain. We're told that as punishment for his behavior, he was going to have a disease of the bowels. And it says for 2 years, he suffered tremendous pain with this disease of the bowels until he died. You can speculate about what that was. Maybe it was cancer, something of that sort. But at any rate, he died very painfully. And then his son took the throne, and his son was Ahaziah, named the same as the dead king from Israel. Ahaziah was going to go visit Joram up there in Samaria when he became king. He only ruled for a year, Ahaziah did, and he was assassinated. He was going to go visit up in Samaria right after he became king, and the question is why? And it's because they're related to each other. Ahab is the father of Joram, and Ahab is the grandfather of Ahaziah. So Joram is his probably half-uncle. He's not a full uncle. They had the same father, probably different mothers, which makes him, I believe, a half-uncle and a half-nephew. Anyway, Ahaziah, the young 22-year-old king, just taken the throne, decides to go up to Samaria, which is a 2 or 3 day trip, and he's going to visit with Uncle Joram. And they're going to perhaps talk about politics or whatever. And that's where the story is picked up in the Bible. It says, Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 1 year. Now, if they only mention 1 year, that means he didn't even make it past one of the New Year periods, because they would have called that 2 years. So he was probably king for just a few months before he was assassinated. His mother's name was Athaliah, a granddaughter of Omri, king of Israel, and a daughter of Ahab. Nasty, nasty woman, as we're going to see next week. It says, Ahaziah walked in the ways of the house of Ahab. This is the young 22-year-old king who's going up to Samaria to visit his half-uncle. He walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for he was related by marriage to Ahab's family. In other words, she had influenced him, obviously. His father was a monster, having killed his brothers and the different things that he did. And so Ahaziah was well indoctrinated in the ways of the house of Ahab. And it says, Ahaziah went down to Jezreel to see Joram. And this is an interesting phraseology when it says down. Actually, the way we would describe it is he went up to Samaria. He went north. Anytime you leave Jerusalem in the Bible, you're going down. Doesn't matter where you're going, north, south, east, west. First of all, Jerusalem is on a hill surrounded by valleys, and you go down, and then you have to come up out of the valleys to the higher land. But it's always referred to as going down from Jerusalem, wherever you go. So anyway, he went to Jezreel, not Samaria. His uncle is down in Jezreel, down there in the Winter Palace, probably. Now, about this very same time, Elisha finally finished the commission that was given to Elijah. When Elijah was instructed to see that Jehu would be anointed as king of Israel. This is probably 10 or 15 years after the experience on Mount Sinai. Years have passed. Elijah has died. Finally, Elisha is accomplishing that task. He has gone across the river over into Jordan, where Jehu is a military officer leading his army. And he has anointed him and said, the Lord has decreed that you are to be king of Israel. And as the Bible points it out, he says, I anoint you king over Israel, and then goes on to say, the whole house of Ahab will perish. Now, once again, we have an individual who is being told, the Lord has ordered this, Yahweh has ordered this, but he is not a worshiper of Yahweh at that point. He has grown up in Israel. He's a worshiper of the sin of Jeroboam, a worshiper perhaps of Baal. But Elisha has come in and said, the Lord has intended that you are going to accomplish this. And then Elisha goes on to say, as for Jezebel, dogs will devour her on the plot of ground at Jezreel, and no one will bury her. So, Jehu traveled from Ramoth Gilead, where he killed Joram, Ahaziah, and Jezebel. He started things off. We have Ahaziah, the young king from Jerusalem, sitting there with his uncle Joram. They're sitting there on the patio having some wine maybe and talking about the Super Bowl and politics perhaps. And Jehu has come galloping across the valley. Joram jumps in his chariot, tries to gallop away, and it says Jehu drew his bow and shot him between the shoulders. He then ordered his men, pick him up and throw him on the field that belonged to Naboth. Now at this point, Ahaziah, the young king, realizes that there's a problem, jumps in his chariot, tries to escape, and Jehu chases him down, mortally wounds him, and he's able to get as far as Megiddo before he dies. So we have this remarkable incident where both kings, the kings of two kingdoms, are killed at the same time. The question, of course, is why was Ahaziah killed by Jehu? And it's because he's a descendant of Ahab. He's part of the house of Ahab. Now that leaves Athaliah down in Jerusalem who has to be dealt with, and we'll deal with her next week. But at this point, he has decapitated both kingdoms, and now he has to set about cleaning out the house of Ahab, basically. It says, Jehu chased Ahaziah, wounded him in his chariot, but he escaped to Megiddo and died there. Now, Jehu then sets about completing his task. It says he went to Jezreel, presumably the palace or the house of the kings from Samaria or outside the town. I mean, they wouldn't have been in the center of town. They probably had a nice estate. So he went into town, and Jezebel saw him coming, and when she heard about it, she painted her eyes, arranged her hair, and looked out a window. Now, you have to be impressed with the composure with which she sees the arrival of Jehu. She knows what's going to happen, and yet she is prepared for her last scene. She goes in, she does her hair, does her makeup, probably puts on a nice dress, and goes to the window and sits there calmly waiting for Jehu to arrive. He arrives below the window, calls up to her. They exchange a few words, and then Jehu says, throw her down. The soldiers go in, throw her out the window, and then we get this remarkable statement in the Bible. It says, they threw her down, and some of her blood spattered the wall and the horses as they trampled her underfoot. You have to understand what war horses were in those days. They were trained to trample soldiers on the ground and charge through foot soldiers. And so here's Jehu with his chariot and his war horses, and she comes down, hits the ground. The horses would begin to trample her and kick her, and it says her blood spattered the wall and the horses as they trampled her underfoot. So she was trampled to death. And Jehu, at this point, decided to take a break. He went in, ate, and drank. And it says when they went back to bury her, they found nothing except her skull, her feet, and her hands. In other words, fulfillment of the prophecy. What would that be from? Well, Jehu said, this is the word of Yahweh. On the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh. So apparently feral dogs who were running around in the streets see this battered body lying in the ground, and they ran over and they literally tore her apart, leaving the inedible parts behind, the skull and the feet and the hands. And then he goes on to say that Jezebel's body will be like refuse on the ground in the plot at Jezreel, so that no one will be able to even identify her. No one will be able to say, this is Jezebel. Her body will be totally destroyed. Of course, that becomes a feature of Christian art, and I particularly like this one. Again, we have an artist in Europe someplace who has never been to the Holy Land. So you have this huge Gothic courtyard that they're standing in, and you have the king there, you have Jehu, who's going to become king, standing there wearing his European royal garb and his crown, and that is not a warrior-like pose or attire. I mean, and lying on the ground, you have the body of Jezebel being shredded by the dogs, and they have pieces of flesh in the dog's mouth. I mean, it's a wonderful picture. If you want an illustration of the story, and you're in church and you're illiterate, unfortunately, can't read the Bible, you can now see the stories depicted in the art. Actually, this is probably a little more realistic. You see a building with a second story, and she's being thrown out of the window there. And then here is a picture of, this is on the grounds at Jezreel, probably in the 1800s. Some traveler had drawn that. They still had a little tower. This would not date, of course, to the time of the Bible, but it's probably not too far distant from what would have been the type of building that Jezebel might have been in. So anyway, she was up in an upper story and was thrown out the window and trampled to death by the horses. However, using archaeological reconstruction, and everybody's like, I'm trying to show you something here that we know what the real Jezebel did look like, and they have been able to depict her here. And you can see that she was an evil-looking woman and a temptress. Here is an aerial photo of the excavations that were done at Jezreel, I think in the 1980s. It was a sizable city. You can see the Jordan Plain, the plain of the Jordan River, just at the top there. And then on a slight rise above it, you have this entire area that's been excavated. It's a sizable site. Nothing of unique discovery there, but nevertheless a remarkable site. And to get a sense of size, there are a couple of trucks that are driving by, so it gives you a sense of what's there. Actually, the site of Jezreel probably was the entire greenish area that you see around there, but the excavated area is in the center. And here is an aerial photo of looking to the south down the Jordan Valley, which you can see off there, with Jordan off in the distance to the left. Directly below us in the center there is that small spit of land that was the city of Jezreel. And then that big mound in the background is Mount Gilboa, where Saul was killed in his fights with the Philistines. So you get a sense of the terrain here. You have Jezreel, which is located probably 300 or 400 feet below sea level. The Sea of Galilee, which is just off to your left shoulder in this picture, is 600 feet below sea level, but this is raised up a tiny bit. And the Jordan River runs all the way down to the Dead Sea, which is 1,200 feet below sea level in a very narrow valley. And so Jezreel would have been considerably warmer in the winter than it would have been up in Samaria. So the kings would come down here and spend their winter months in the, this is probably the Florida of the kingdom of Israel. They all come down here during the winter. Jehu arranged for further executions. He sent a letter up to Samaria, and he ordered what are referred to as the leading men of the city to execute the 70 royal princes. Now, the 70, I'm arguing, is a symbolic number. It's not a real number. It probably means all of them, or an entirety, something of that sort. Any of the special numbers in the Bible, 40, 70, and so sevens and so forth, 12s, lots of 12s in the book of Revelation. These are symbolic numbers and are not, in my opinion, to be taken as literal numbers most of the time, although sometimes they are. 7 was a special number, and if you multiplied any of those numbers by 10, that would make them even more special. And of course, we have that passage where Jesus is asked, how many times should I forgive? 7 times? And he says, no, I tell you, 77. 7 times 10 plus another 7, perhaps. In other words, he's not telling you to forgive 77 times. He's telling you to keep forgiving. Now, the Bible says, when Jehu's letter, see, he wrote a letter to the men up in Samaria. When Jehu's letter arrived, these men took the princes and slaughtered all 70 of them, put their heads in baskets and sent them to Jehu, who's still down in Jezreel. Now, this would have taken a couple of days, the letter to arrive, for the princes to be slaughtered, put their heads in baskets, and then have somebody ship these 70 baskets down to Jezreel, or all of the baskets. But meanwhile, Jehu is attending to business down in Jezreel as well. It says he killed everyone in Jezreel who remained of the house of Ahab, as well as all his chief men, his close friends, and his priests, leaving him no survivor. In other words, anybody who was associated with Ahab down in Jezreel was executed. Friends, neighbors, family, priests, everybody. Now, once he had done that, he started traveling up the road to Samaria, and he happened upon a group of travelers, a group of men who were coming from Jerusalem. These are all friends and relatives of the young king Ahaziah who come up to visit with Joram. And all of they're coming up maybe to help with the celebration. Ahaziah's come to the throne. He's going to visit Uncle Joram, and they're going to have celebrations. And this group of people run into Jehu, who identifies them as friends and relatives of Ahaziah, and he slaughters them on the road there. All 42 of them, left no survivors. Then he continues on up into Samaria, and it says when Jehu came to Samaria, he killed all who were left there of Ahab's family. In other words, the sons had been, the various sons and princes and so forth had been dispatched, but there were still a lot of family, a lot of relatives in the city of Samaria. And you can imagine the scene in Samaria as the soldiers wander through the streets, cutting people down, the screaming, the slaughter that was going on. But he basically was eliminating anybody who had any connection with Ahab. Then he determined he was going to eliminate the worship of Baal. And he sent word out that all of the priests of Baal were to come to Samaria for a major celebration. And they all came. They all wanted, first of all, to be a part of this celebration, thanking Baal for deliverance, basically what they're saying, thanking them for deliverance from Ahab. And also they wanted to curry favor with the new king, who has demonstrated that he's a man of action. Jehu's in there slaughtering everybody, so the priests want to come and be a part of the new administration. And they all came. It says no one stayed away, and they crowded into the temple of Baal until it was full from one end to the other. They're all wearing their nicest robes. They're there to celebrate and to be acknowledged by the new king. But what does Jehu do? He closes the doors, sends his soldiers inside, and they cut them down with the sword. Slaughtered all of them in the temple of Baal. Now, this would contaminate and corrupt the temple of Baal, making it unusable forever. That was the way you would corrupt all of these high places. You'd put burned bones or sprinkle blood or whatever, and that would corrupt them, and they could no longer be used as a sacred place. So he slaughtered however many priests of Baal there were. We're not told how many there were, but according to the stories of Jezebel, we are told that there were hundreds of these priests scattered around the kingdom, and they all would have come and crowded in there to be part of the celebration, and ended up being part of the sacrifice. Then what they did was they tore the temple down. They demolished the sacred stone of Baal, which would have been the standing stone that represented him, kind of like an idol, probably in the front of the temple. And then they tore down the temple of Baal, and people have used it for a latrine to this day. To this day means the fellow penning those words. Whenever these words were written, it was still being used as a latrine, and that's very understandable as well. In those days, there's no plumbing in these cities. Typically, they would use chamber pots and then dump them, often in the streets. And the streets would be foul until the first big rains, which would wash the streets clean. But when they slaughtered the priests of Baal, that corrupted the ground. And then they tore down the temple. This was contaminated, corrupted ground, unusable for anything. And it seems quite logical that people would step over there to use these piles of stone as a bathroom, or perhaps empty their chamber pots there. And so it was used as a latrine, and the ground was probably never sanctified again or used by anybody else. Isn't this fun? These stories are just, these stories are brutal. So it says Jehu destroyed Baal worship in Israel. Now the problem was he was instructed to return the land to the worship of Yahweh. He destroyed Baal worship. He wiped out the priests of Baal. He destroyed the temple of Baal. But it says he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, the worship of the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. Now this is an astonishing comment right here. Here's a man who was commissioned by a priest of Yahweh, a priest of the Lord, by Elisha, to perform certain tasks. He was familiar with the worship of Yahweh. But if you look at it critically, this is a man who was raised in a country where the sin of Jeroboam was the dominant faith, and then the priests of Baal were brought in, and Baal worship had been the law of the land for quite some time, and he simply reverted back to what he already knew. And he and his descendants, his sons, and then the successors to his sons, would continue to worship the sin of Jeroboam, continuing to lead the people of Israel astray, and eventually the entire kingdom was going to be wiped from the face of the earth by the Assyrians, and we'll be talking about that next time. Jehu was also mentioned in outside documents, and this is so important. We have something called the Black Obelisk. This particular one was also commissioned by Shalmaneser III, who's not mentioned in the Bible. It has 4 sides to it. It's about 7 or 8 feet tall, and it has all these little panels on it, like cartoons, in which it's listing people who are paying tribute to Shalmaneser III. And we have this one panel on the Black Obelisk that you see right there, and it shows a man down on his knees. The inscription says Yah, the son of Omri. Now this is an Assyrian representation of the name of Jehu. He would have been called Yahu. So this is an actual picture of Jehu bowing down to the Assyrian king, paying tribute. We are able to date this particular obelisk to a particular date, which gives us, using the other documents that we have, we're able to determine not only the date of the death of Ahab, but the date that Jehu took the throne, and then we're able to work out the dates of all of the kings from that. So an incredibly important finding here, and you have to assume that perhaps this was orchestrated from above because we have the names of Ahab and Jehu and a few other kings in Assyrian documents with ages and dates that we can then assign to the Bible stories. Very, very important. So, next week, what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to look at a pagan queen sitting on the throne in Jerusalem, Atalia. Vile woman, and we'll deal with her comeuppance. We're also going to deal with the destruction of Samaria by the Assyrians. And so these are extremely important events in God's plan, and you don't want to miss it.